Welcome to Secrets of Successful Advisors with Ken Heyman, the podcast where we dive deep into the habits, mindsets, and strategies that set top financial advisors apart. I'm Scott Tatum, and today I'll be talking with Ken to explore his thoughts on a high-functioning team's checklist. Before we begin, I'd like to draw your attention to an important service from our sponsor, Total Family. If you are working with ultra-high net worth clients and find yourself stuck when it comes to getting families engaged in conversations about wealth and money, Total Family offers a platform advisors can offer to their clients. If you want to learn more, go to totalfamily.io. That's totalfamily.io. So Ken, let's get our listeners in the right frame of mind. You can't delve deeply into the psyche of clients while dwelling in our busy world. So let's leave the outside world behind for 25 minutes and look deep inside human behavior to explore the science of clients, setting instincts aside so that insights can guide. And today, those insights are going to revolve around the insights of our listeners, the financial advisor. Because Ken, we are going to deal with a topic that I know is close to both of our hearts, and that is what makes for high-functioning teams. I know for 40 years, you've worked with, relationships and team relationships that are sometimes not functioning at a high level, sometimes functioning at a better level. Kind of, what do we need to know about team dynamics?
Well, this is the question of the day in the financial services industry, Scott. You and I, obviously traveling every week, are encountering more and more the fact that the most productive business models are team models. They're utilizing specialization across the team. They are expanding their marketing footprint by having a larger number of people. They're bringing together complementary and sometimes, similar skill sets to build out a larger footprint that can manage a larger number of clients and utilize human talent better. It is the future of the industry. Every firm is encouraging it, and some are, in fact, demanding or requiring it. And yet the challenge with this is the industry is not set up and has not historically been set up to deal with group dynamics as opposed to individual dynamics. If you think about how our advisors recognized by their firm, it's still who has the largest amount of production in their number. Now, maybe we have a shared number. A lot of times we look at teams and it's just an aggregation of individuals that are trying to hit a breakpoint on their payout grid. That's not actually a team, that's an affiliation. But increasingly, there are vertically organized or horizontally organized multi-generational teams that are really trying to create an organizational structure. And when we go out and see them, there's a couple of things that accrue. One is, for me, it's almost a daily conversation. I know you and I have talked about this. We sit down with a group and they're like, we're doing the best we can. We've never really done this before. We don't know if we're doing well or not. Our revenue is certainly up. Is that a good indicator that we're a high functioning team? Is that the best indicator? As long as our revenue keeps going up, are we good? And yet, then of course you look at there's high turnover, there's internal conflicts, there's lack of coherence about messaging. And we would suggest, that revenue is a good indicator that something's going well here, right? And yet there's other indicators that maybe there are things that are not in place. The other day I was at a big conference, and as an example of this, a very, very vivid and very granular example of this, I was at a conference and I was talking about pricing and how to price your business and how to reprice if you have a large business and you've priced at all different levels. How do you bring that into alignment? And I had an individual raise a question to me. This is a female advisor, one of the peer partners of a 3-partner team with 8 or 9 subordinates. And she said, my 2 colleagues and I all price differently, and therefore our business is priced all over the map. And we are starting to realize we need to create some kind of standard pricing model and bring all of our clients into a model that has integrity across our business. Otherwise, we're incurring a risk. And also, for each other, there's the sense of I'm pricing at a higher level, I'm creating more revenue. There's all kinds of implicit risk and conflict. But she said, but we are not wired up to think cohesively with each other about how to do this. I said, well, there's a very simple way to address this on the team, and that is to come to an agreement, 3 peers, that we really need to address this, to establish a shared institutional fee scale that defines how we will price for each of us, and then proceed forward with the assumption that if one of us wants to discount a client, before we can offer the discount, we have to ask our peer partners for permission to do so. So if we're going to depart from the agreed, we have to get permission from our two peer partners. I said, which will stop this spread of decision making and hold everybody accountable to an institutional standard. For her, she literally was writing each pieces of this thing down because it never occurred to this team to do this. They didn't have a precedent. They didn't have a set of assumptions. They didn't have principles to inform how they were running their team. So this is everywhere in the industry, and everybody who's on a team has reason to look at that and say, okay, what are we missing? What might we be missing? What are the things we need to make sure we're doing? And I think that's really where we need to have a point of view to offer our clients so that they can be more successful with this.
And I'm so glad you started with that because, I hope our listeners approach this topic with a state of at least giving themselves some grace. This whole concept of teaming is really recent in the arc of this industry. And no one was recruited into this industry for group achievement, right? We recruit people for individual achievement. We put a bunch of type A's together and go figure it out. So when it comes to kind of figuring it out, we've done so many consultations and we see teams where things are maybe not going so well and teams where they kind of are. Have you kind of established from that psychological background of yours any general observations of what is present in those teams that are doing well?
Absolutely. We can look at this from a kind of a general principle perspective, which is helpful because the general principles kind of translate into guiding decisions and behavior. And we can actually look at it then more granularly. But if you want to start with principles, there's two that I think set apart the higher functioning or the healthier team from those that are affiliations or just kind of bumbling along with the process. And maybe a good place to start with that is to say, look, every industry struggles with this. When you put high functioning individual human beings who are very intelligent and very competitive, you put a bunch of alpha humans, male and female, into a room, you're going to get a lot of bumping into each other. You're going to get a lot of opinions, and you're going to have to find some way to sort that out. The challenge in financial services, as you just pointed out, is it's so individually oriented that the idea that the heroic individual is what we want to pay attention to is that when you do try to build a team, then there's this difficulty in deciding, well, what is the team about? So if you look in the biggest level of organizing principles for a team, there are two that I see that teams that are moving toward a more ideal internal cohesive structure are doing. And the first is they have a really clear mission about what the entire team is about, what we're trying to accomplish. That mission includes who we're trying to serve, how we're trying to serve them, what are the big issues we're trying to address, what this team is about, why it matters that we're in the world, what the world would miss if we weren't here. So it has to do with unique value proposition. It has to do with business design, it has to do with all this. But at its root is the sense that we as an organization have a mission that we're trying to fulfill. And we agree on our mission. We are all joining into this group together. So there's an overarching structure of idea that we're all paying attention to as we move forward. I have an ongoing consultation with a very large and rapidly growing group. When I originally met with them, there was 3 of them as peers. They now have an 80-person organization. They're growing toward 150 in the next 2 or 3 years. This organization has a cornerstone set of principles, one of which is our mission is client-centered, always client-centered. Every decision is client-centered. And our mission is to hold each other to a standard of excellence and drive each other to a higher standard of excellence. So every day, those guiding principles inform how they work with each other and what they're trying to accomplish out in the field. And because of those guiding principles, they're very creative and they're very expansive and they're coming up with new ideas and they're launching new ideas. But it's very much a they, us, not me, I. So mission is the first. And the second, and this is one we probably really ought to explore more, is this idea of efficient institution. We are not a group of individuals doing what we like. We're not 3 people that come together that had nice businesses and everything's going to stay the same for each of us and somehow we'll affiliate and maybe cross-pollinate with some business. No, it's an efficient institution. We're part of an institution. And efficiency means that there's a sense of the institution defining how we do things, what we're doing, why we do it, what we're not doing, who we're not working with, how we price, how we serve. All of these things are rooted in an institutional agreement. Now, just a quick comment on that, because there's a lot to this. The idea of institutionalizing a team structure is a big deal, and it's not easy. And there are principles we need to follow to do that. But here's the thing. If you're an individual and you are seeking to monetize the value of what you've built, and you're part of monetizing means you're exiting, and you are the value proposition of the organization, but you're going to exit, it's a problem. And transitioning clients from advisor to advisor, especially now as prices have been driven up so high with the investments coming from private equity, that's a problematic idea, that you're the cornerstone of the value, you're the value proposition, and you're leaving it to somebody else who now has to be the core value proposition. If you have an institution and the clients are served by the institution, and the institution is run by a variety of people, and individuals are not the issue, the institution's combined genius is what's serving clients, that is a portable value. An individual can leave, can take their share, and it can continue to provide to the clients unbroken, seamless service. That is a pretty high value proposition to think about. Now, getting there requires paying attention to a lot of very detailed issues, but it's this idea of mission and building an efficient institution is the starting point for becoming high functioning.
And it strikes me that what you've just described is an evolution from a practice, which is about the practitioners. And that is, remember, the grace we want to extend to everybody. That's what everyone was recruited to be, right? You be your practitioner, you run your world. And then we started to amalgamate practitioners together into these kind of loose confederations. And I think what you're talking about is the evolution from a practice to a business, because the business is not about the individual. It's about the entity. Well, there's got to be more than just kind of a general idea, right? So if you're really getting into what a business is, what an institution is, how do you know if you're moving that direction?
Well, that is the question. So everyone who's on a team needs to understand these two ideas. Mission, what is our mission? They need to be able to tell others what the mission is, right? And out of that would grow value proposition, marketing materials, dinner time conversations at a party, right? Now you have an institutional outreach that everyone's participating in, right? And then there's the sense of the efficient institution, how we do things thoughtfully, not as individuals, but like my case study at the very beginning. Here's a peer team of 3. How are we going to price? And how are we going to help each other sustain a discipline about pricing, even when we feel this strong need to discount? Well, by creating an institutional process that requires permission to discount, you change the conversation. By the way, that's why the car salesman goes back and talks to the manager, takes a break from the conversation so they can regroup and be firmer about their pricing in the process. But for teams, and because this is such a new idea, what we've observed over the course of, 30 years now working with financial advisors, is there are some features that you can organize into some guiding principles, a variety of guiding principles, and actually can use sort of as a checklist to say, okay, yeah, we're doing really well there based on that principle. But principle number 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever we encounter here, that one we are really struggling with, and maybe we need to do some work on. Now, that may be work as a group or maybe bring in external resources. By the way, almost every organization has external resources that you can tap into. And there are lots of independent programs out there, lots of independent consultants that will come in and help you with each of these pieces. What this offers perhaps is just an idea of, okay, let's take a hard look at our organization. Let's pick 1 or 2 areas out of these specifics that might be helpful. For example, what we observe of great institutions is that they organize the way they're going to service clients according to an institutional defined standard of care. Now, I was in a big conference 2 weeks ago, and I was exposed to some tools that were developed by a big wirehouse organization. And one of these tools, really fascinating, was a brochure that listed all of the services available on this platform, broken out by service. 165. That's pretty amazing in its magnitude, and obviously beyond the scope of anybody's ability to absorb or to manage. However, it's a great starting place to think about, well, what if we were to, as a team, agree with how we service our clients and what we're going to provide from the platform to our clients? What's our standard of care, right? Now, that standard of care can be rooted in our target market, in a level of wealth, in an age group where complexity may have added more needs to this client. You can look at all the things you can offer somebody, and you can look at the type of clients you're servicing, and you can begin to create a standard model. Now, why would that be important? Well, that means that the institution of the practice can ensure that every client's getting everything they need. By the way, that's a revenue enhancement for any organization, right? It means that each practitioner on the team, the senior and the junior, are all looking through the same lens at what the client needs, right? So what we can do then is we can then assess how well have we serviced the client. We can actually have a separate person, maybe the operating officer, if it's a large enough team, go in and check and say, okay, how are we doing with each client? Are clients missing anything? So it's a quality of care insurance. It's a standard of care that each of us can appeal to. It allows us to spread our knowledge base across the organization. When you build one, you use all the wisdom of the organization to say, here's how we can look at this. Well, I've never really been much for insurances, but insurance should be a big part of what we do here. We're going to push everybody to see clients through a similar lens. An institutional standard of care is a huge deal. And actually, we think so much of it at the Advisor Institute, as you know, Scott, that we've actually published a whole series of how to build these things out. But for my observation of high-functioning teams, this is an indicator of very high functioning. This is an indicator that we are fully institutionalizing what we're doing. So as a principal, that would be the place I would start. But there's clearly a lot of other stuff that they should be doing as well.
All right. So when you start thinking about that checklist, if you start with this shared business standard of care, it's not individual from the advisor, it is point to point to point. Where do you go to next? Because that's a big one, right? That's a big kind of operating system.
That's why I put it up front on this thing. And I mean, when you look at these principles of how to think about institutionalizing an organization, they all come into play, and you should take a look at your organization from that. What I would suggest is most organizations don't have an institutional standard of care. They have individual standards of care. They will benefit in so many ways by moving up market. But in the same way, I would suggest that a high-functioning team also has an institutional point of view, a shared point of view about the role of the financial plan. Now, there's a lot of people out there like no duh, Ken, financial planning is important. Yes, but what I observe is even on teams, different members of the team have different sense of how much of a financial plan. What are we using the plan for? What happens if the client's reluctant to do a financial plan? Hey, I just want to engage you for... No, the financial plan as a way of being able to answer this question, the fundamental question of the team should be, when the client needs to know, can you provide me evidence that the future I want is the future I'm going to get? This is our essential definition of what clients are looking for from teams. They may not know that, but that's what they're looking for when they hire an advisor. How can you provide evidence that the future that you want is the future you're going to get, which is what much of reporting is about, if you don't know the qualities of the future they're trying to create? And if you don't know why they're trying to create it, and you don't know what the trade-offs and priorities and values within that vision are. So when I sit down with teams and there's this disparity of perspectives on planning, again, I'm suggesting as a team, the benefit to you all is if you see it in the same light and are able to answer the question in the same way. Again, why? Well, eventually, the person who's doing that financial plan is no longer going to be servicing this client at some point. Now we have a standard way that the client will continue to get that. So an institutional idea on the financial plan would be another area. And a third area is, what do we think about the capital markets? I remember years ago, I worked with a big team in the mid-Atlantic states, and they were very successful. There were 7 of them as peer partners. 6 all agreed on their capital markets perspective, and they had 1 nudge in the corner who was always in this bearish mindset and always disagreeing. And what would happen is that clients would call in, and the clients knew, a number of the different advisors, and they got one of the advisors who was, more bullish and had this sense of the shared perspective with everyone else, they would confirm what they're seeing. But if somebody called in and would get this individual, they'd have a completely different perspective. And it became conflictual and confusing because clients would say, well, he thinks this and you think that. What? How should I? It was a dreadful experience. So they called me in to work with the whole team of 7 to come to some way of resolving this. So the day of the meeting where they're bringing me in, and it's going to be a half-day workshop on getting coherent about this individual decided not to come to the meeting. So we had 6 partners who were there, and we all got really clear about how to communicate the capital markets. By the way, that's a different experience. That's a different idea. What are we going to communicate? And then how do we do it? There's a lot of great ways we can help folks determine how to communicate. This person didn't come. So I made an arrangement to come back in 6 months and see how things were going and see if they'd been able as a group to get to clarity. And I came back in and sat down with them, and they all came in, the 6 of them I met with before, and said, well, by the way, we've had 1 departure from the team since last year. And they were all relieved. And I'm sure that person was relieved as much as that was probably jarring for them to go through. But now the clients weren't going to be in a conflictual place. So what do we got so far? Again, as I said, there's a lot of stuff here, right? We've got a standard of care, institutionalized, an institutionalized perspective on planning. We've got an institutionalized perspective on the capital markets.
Yeah, and Ken, I think we're kind of at time. Let's take a pause there. I want to review what we've covered today. I think it's important. You started off with kind of this understanding that the way we have put teams together really was it was not to create a high functioning business. It was an amalgamation of individual achievers. And we've seen teams struggle with this, and that's really understandable. And we've seen teams figure out how to thrive. And when it comes to teams that have figured out how to thrive, there's a couple of elements that really tend to come through. It's a shared mission, and it's a high functioning group that really focuses on efficiency. And then when you think about that, it's like, okay, now we need more detail. We need a checklist. And we got started on the checklist. I think we need to finish the checklist in our next podcast. But the first 3 elements of that checklist, the big one, is a shared standard of care. And then we start thinking of elements of that. It's doing financial planning, using the software the same way every time at the same interval for the same types of clients. And then the last one you covered was a similar outlook on the capital markets. I know there's more to it, and I think our listeners are going to find this immensely helpful so that they've got something they can compare to, right? A way to keep score, which is something that financial advisors really love. So as our listeners return to their busy world of running those practices, let me remind you that we would love your idea for future podcast topics. Just go on LinkedIn and either come to myself, Scott Tatum, or to Ken Heyman's page and just message us and say, all right, hotshots, why don't you cover this on one of the next topics? And we would be delighted to have your suggestions. So that's a wrap on this edition of Secrets of Successful Advisors with Ken Heyman, the podcast where we explore the science of clients setting instincts aside so that insights can guide.